Welcome to the Arena Decklists podcast. I'm Jerry Thompson, joined by Brian Gottlieb, and we're going to be doing some more Alchemy today. Maybe the last one for a little bit for all of the anti-Alchemy folks out there. But we also have some previews from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So that's cool.
Eternal preview season marches on. If you don't like the new cards we were talking about last week, just hang around and there'll be more new cards right around the corner.
Well, there's a little break until like previews officially start, right? Like this is just a little teaser, I guess.
That seems correct to me. Excited for this set, though. I didn't have a huge amount of really like any association with the original Kamigawa run. That was in one of my downtimes. So,
oh, no.
Yeah, when I returned to Magic, it was at the very tail end of Kamigawa's legality and standard. And so I didn't go back and pick it up as like a limited format, but I'm familiar with a bunch of the cards for their impact on the tail end of standard. And of course, the more iconic ones, which have lasted throughout the eternal formats I'm familiar with. But as far as just like being in the midst of Kamigawa block, not really super tight to me, but I think I can reveal this. I'm going to reveal it here for the first time ever.
Oh, wow.
This next pass through Kamigawa, I actually got to have some input on some of these cards. I did a contract position with Wizards on this set. First time I ever had a hand in designing the Magic cards. And my influence is very, 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 very small over this set. I want to make that clear. So don't yell at me if there's something you don't like. I promise I didn't have anything to do with that particular thing. But if you love something, it was 100% my idea, and I fixed that card without a doubt.
I'm pretty sure you're going to have to expand on that because I didn't know that we were revealing that. And I know that there are going to be a lot of questions.
Okay. I just was brought in very late in the process to give some broad feedback on the set. And that's about it. I mean, it wasn't really a super formal thing. I haven't played with the cards. I was doing it all just on site. And the folks at Wizards listened to my feedback, thought about it, and weighed it in their final decisions.
Okay. So do you know approximately like how much time you spent?
It was over a 2-week period that I was involved with it. So,
okay.
You know, like I said, my role is, I don't want to overstate my role, extremely small, but just trying to catch any outliers, think about things that maybe had gotten lost in the shuffle, and just, you know, a general pass through, once over, if you will. Okay.
And then while this was going on, did you get to like see FFL decks or anything
Nope.
like that? Okay.
Nope. It was completely isolated. So that no context really, which is, it's a challenge, you know, but you're still able to give a measure of feedback in that scenario. And I think that getting that feedback is something I've talked about. You know, I wasn't trying to make work for myself. I just thought it was a good idea in general to bring in some outside people. So when you work in a group like the way Wizards does, it can be very easy to just kind of focus in on one thing, get tunnel vision. And I think it's always good to be able to bring in some outside eyes. So they acted on that feedback. And I worked alongside someone else who folks might be familiar with. I'll leave it to them if they're going to say what their role is. But it was good. It was a really positive process. And it was exciting for me, just as someone who has been around the game for so long, to be able to contribute. And also just got to like give props to Wizards because, you know, I'm not always super kind to Wizards. I can be very, very critical and still willing to bring me in to work on the product. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can speak to some of the stuff that you're talking about too, where I sort of had the same experience you did, at least for like the first few days I was there, where this was Constantark here, right? So like I get there and they basically just like printed me out set files for all the stuff. And this is obviously like more broad than what you're talking about working with, but it was like, all right, here are all the set files for like the things that are in FFL, with cons being the newest set. And it was just like, you know, go through here. If you have thoughts on a card, let us know, because, you know, they have been working with the stuff for so long that it's easy to get tunnel visioned. And I certainly fell prey to that like many months later when I was still working there, right? So I was kind of like off on an island on my own, like looking through these files, thinking about things, making like mental notes, building decks, etc. And I think that for me personally, that was a ton of fun because I don't know, just get to have like this dump of information to work with, and my brain just loves it, right? And then they like it because they get that outsider perspective, which you pointed out is so very valuable. And I mean, it's hard to say like how much of an impact I had or how much of an impact you had or whatever, but regardless, it is a valuable thing to get that. And it's cool that they are doing a thing like this because I think that, especially given like the last few years or whatever, it's like anything that they can do to help ease the process a little bit and make it so maybe they don't get blindsided by like things being like a little bit too strong or whatever is definitely very helpful. So. Yeah.
And, we keep talking about safety valves and how we keep spotting safety valves on cards. It's clear that they are taking the issues that we had going back to Throne of Eldraine and that surrounding time period. They're taking those issues seriously. They realized, I don't want to speak for them, I feel they've realized that some of the things they did in that time period were a step too far. And they certainly have taken steps to make sure you don't go down that road again. And also we have the safety valve of Alchemy now. So there's a lot of ways to kind of correct these things that could go wrong.
Right. And we were very harsh during that time period, but I guess we haven't necessarily like gone back and updated our stance or whatever, where it's like these last few sets, there's some outliers, right? Like Omnath, Alrund's Epiphany, whatever. But for the most part, since it was very clear that there was a problem, it does seem like that has gotten reined in a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And, the sets have both been like pretty fun and exciting and also not super busted like they were. So overall, good news.
Agreed. And that's one of the reasons why, like, I think I went a little bit harder than Alrund's Epiphany than I would have in a lot of spots, is I just thought everything else was so good. I thought they had made such strides in like bringing the power level back down and making an environment where things could be exciting and there could be a bunch of good decks competing. And it was just these one or two outliers that were really preventing us from getting to that world.
Right. Yeah, I mean, before it was like, all right, well, if you ban Oko, then then Fires is a problem, and whatever.
We played this game week to week. We were here doing it where, you could ban this, but then you have to do this, and it was just no end of disasters. Where it feels like the disasters in Standard are kind of small, and I think Alchemy's sort of displaying that in a lot of ways.
And we will get to that later.
We will.
So, Champions in Kamigawa was not like right when I started going hard. It was, I guess, like Onslaught, Mirrodin, and then Champions. So like I got my first constructed GP top 8 during Champions. And
nice.
I distinctly remember, going to my friend's house every weekend and just like doing a bunch of drafts or traveling to PTQs or whatever. And like I was playing this set and these formats a ton. And I guess I didn't really like realize how kind of like excited I was going to be for this set until I started watching the live stream. It was just like, yeah, this is all awesome. Like I'm definitely enjoying like a lot of this. And it seemed like a lot of other people were like, there were upwards of 10,000 people watching the preview stream when it was going on, which is awesome. A lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that we get hyped in general for like these nostalgic trips back to Plains. It does seem like the excitement rolls a little harder for the nostalgia sets than it does for just the new IPs. And you would expect that. I mean, that's just sort of how it works. It's why Hollywood is loaded with sequels, right? It's way easier to sell something that people are already familiar with. So I'm not shocked to hear that reaction, but I do think there's something special about Kamigawa for a set that mechanically was sort of cast aside and really looked at as a bunch of failed experiments. It's funny how much the flavor and the tone of the set has really resonated with people over time.
Yeah. I mean, like the previews are like, Ninja Planeswalker, Dragon, and like an Ogre Demon, right? And it's just like, that is all stuff that resonates and hits.
Yep.
So I'm just like, yeah, this is cool. And then obviously like the full art basics are just absurd in the best way possible,
Yep. Beautiful pieces.
Seems like people really like those too. So far, so good, I think.
That's my read as well. A lot of variants. And sorry for our friends at Scryfall who are going to be putting in all those variants one by one.
Yeah,
But
I mean, there was definitely a lot going on with like the Hidetsugo variants, especially as I was watching the stream, where I'm just like, it's not for me. You know,
that's not going away. That's not going away. So just either accept it and move on, or don't accept it, but you got to move on anyway. So
yeah. So you want to talk about some card specifics here?
I would love to. Let's talk about these 3 preview cards we were blessed with today.
Kaito Suzuki, 1 UB, legendary Planeswalker Kaito, 3 starting loyalty. At the beginning of your end step, if this entered the battlefield this turn, he phases out. +1, draw card, then discard a card unless you attacked this turn. -2, create a 1/1 blue ninja creature token with this creature can't be blocked. And -7, you get an emblem with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle. Worth noting, this question came up during the stream. It like phasing doesn't cause a thing to enter the battlefield.
Right.
So this thing only triggers on the turn you cast it, or if you blink it or whatever. Phasing, it is still there. It's just treated like it is not there. So this is not like unattackable or not attackable Planeswalker or whatever. It just protects itself for the first turn, which is cool.
Really cool. And I soured on the static abilities on Planeswalker thing very quickly, but I think Kaito is a cool way to call back to that and have it not really be quite so static. It's a Planeswalker that does something extra, but it doesn't require this persistent mental tax on you to be like, oh, what does this do again at all times, no matter what? It's just doing that thing once, making sure it's able to gain some footholds onto the battlefield. And that means the first time you're able to realistically attack Kaito, it's sitting at 5 loyalty already if you're just plussing and plussing. And that's a pretty big loyalty base for a 3-mana Planeswalker. Granted, it's a little bit deeper in the game, so it's more likely you have a body that is meaningfully interacting with that sizing at that point. And also, Kaito's not a super defensive Planeswalker, so it's not like it's going to be doing that thing. Although it can protect itself, the 1/1 blue ninja creature token, although it can't be blocked, it can block. So it's got some defensive function. I like how the -2 plays well with the +1, where if you make this unblockable ninja and keep it around, you're just able to +1 to draw a card. That's real powerful on a 3-mana Planeswalker. And then the ultimate, pretty close to game winning. I think this card is solid, interesting, fun, and not really broken or ultra threatening. And I am happy to have those kind of Planeswalkers in the mix always.
Same. A lot of this thing's success is going to depend heavily on like the stuff around it, but obviously they know that ninjas is a widely beloved like theme mechanic, however you want to look at it. And now you have a ninja Planeswalker. I would imagine that there's, some sort of like rogues type of stuff, just in ninja themed, right? And I would hope that this card sees play,
Yeah, even in the context of like the cards we're working with now, it's easy to, I'm going to talk, I guess, a little alchemy now, which is weird how we're going to have to do a little bit of both when we talk about
that's fine. I mean, I think it does make sense if we're talking, because we mostly talk about the previews in the context of standard. I guess we sort of have to do it in terms of alchemy now too.
Yeah. Well, I would mention this card alongside like the mono black decks, which are very, very good and just play a bunch of fodder. They're loaded with 1-drops and you're happily chump attacking with them quite often. In that deck, it's very easy to add an additional color if you need to. As far as like a sideboard juke against control decks where they can't really pressure Kaito, that could be a really nice change up.
I have Sorin in my sideboard currently, and the +1s are pretty functionally similar. And against control, you usually just have a 1-drop line around that you can be attacking with anyway.
Yes, you do. And doing the trick of mana cheaper, also good. But I mean, let's not forget the points where you can use discard as a benefit. Any type of reanimator setups are going to want to put cards into the bin.
Very true.
And Kaito does that very well. So a bunch of really cool pieces on this card. And it is flavorful for a ninja Planeswalker. I think this is just a home run. I really like it.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, there have been so many cards like this that we previewed, and I'm like, I could see it in, if things break like this way or that way or whatever. And then recently, a lot of that stuff has fallen short.
Yep. Jace Cunning Castaway comes to mind immediately.
Yeah, Nico Eris too.
Mm-hmm.
And I like those planeswalkers in theory, just like the formats have not really lined up for them to be successful. But I don't know, like you said, for the mono black deck specifically, it's like, well, yeah, when you put it in that context, I mean, I'm already using Sorin, and this would likely be an upgrade to that, at least in terms of alchemy. So maybe, I'm not going to say like, yeah, slam dunk, this will see play or whatever. But
it also loops back to the first point we were making about the cards that are being printed in general. A lot of this stuff that we're talking about that missed existed in the context of Fire's Invention and Nexus of Fate and a lot of silly stuff. And as that stuff gets toned down, cards like this seem more and more appealing.
Yeah, but when we're talking in terms of actual standard and Epiphany still existing, I mean, if there's some sort of disruptive aggro deck, which, that's historically how they've built like Dimir creature decks, then I could see that being successful and then this seeing play. But like, assuming that this were like a Gruul Planeswalker or whatever, it's like, I don't think it would be a good fit for what those sort of decks need to accomplish in order to succeed.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah, I like it. I'm hopeful.
Same Zeus.
Hidetsugo, Devouring Chaos, 3B, 4/4, legendary creature, Ogre Demon. B, sacrifice a creature, scry 2. 2R, tap, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. When you exile a non-land card this way, this deals damage equal to the exiled card's mana value to any target. I am less high on this card.
Yeah, I am skeptical that this really matters in constructed spaces, but people love this type of effect. I kind of love this type of effect. I like doing the thing where you try to float the huge thing to the top of your library. So there's a deck that does this in Modern now, right? Off of one of the Modern Horizons 2 base cards.
Yeah, Calibrated Blasts, Throes of Chaos, a bunch of lands.
Does this do anything there? I mean, it doesn't get hit off Throes of Chaos, so you're still cascading safely to your Suspend card.
I mean, I guess it could help. Like, if you wanted another potential enabler, I could see it, but it's still just like 4 mana creature that you need to be able to untap with. So I don't think it's going to like help you win games. It gives you like more threats in theory, but
sure. Maybe some more outs too if you're being targeted with like negate type effects. But usually if they have one way to interact with that type of deal, they have another. So yeah, this seems unlikely to make any big waves. The sacrifice ability is interesting. Sacrifice Scry 2 is pretty big, but safety valve here costs a black mana. If you make a free sacrifice outlet, I'm always concerned. Add a black mana. Much less threatening, still potentially relevant, but like you said, doesn't really seem like this is supposed to be a constructed home run.
Yes. Last card, Atsushi the Blazing Sky, 2RR, 4/4, legendary creature, Dragon Spirit, flying, trample. When this dies, choose 1. Exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards or create 3 treasure tokens. I absolutely love this.
Talk to me about what you want to do with this card, because this reads to me as like a very fair, very reasonable dragon. But when you tack on legendariness to it, I get a little lower on it just because even though you're getting a dies trigger, it just feels like I can't do the thing where, like, for instance, again, in Alchemy, there is a dragon's deck. It's often mono red, sometimes splashed with another color, but you're just curving very consistently into your 4-drop, usually Town Razor Tyrant, 5-drop. Goldspan Dragon. Something like this throws a wrench into the plan of just jamming your deck full of Atsushi because, wow, this is going to be a nightmare set for my pronunciation. But the legendary drawback seems like it will matter a bit on this card, and I'm just having a hard time visualizing a home for it right now.
Well, I never said that I like it for constructed.
Got it.
So the original Kamigawa Dragons were very popular, big part of that set. Yep. And now instead of like 6 mana with a big dice trigger, it's looks like, this thing is 4 mana. You get to choose 2 smaller things, but like 4 mana puts it more in line with, today's standard sensibilities rather than back then. And getting a choice, I think, is very, very cool. So this is like on the fringe of playability to me, but all the stuff is appealing,
Yeah, and that is a lot of ramp too. Like going from 4 to if this dies 8 on your next turn. Every set, there's some reason to be tricked into playing big red. They never, ever pan out. But this is another one. And if there's a huge Planeswalker threat that we want to ramp to or something like that, maybe that's how we get it done. Again, in combination with Goldspan Dragon, you're talking just massive, massive mana output. So, we've experimented with treasure type stuff a bunch. Maybe this is just another piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. Or you get the potential to just draw 2 cards off of this thing, which is not that bad either. Yeah,
a conditional draw, but a draw nonetheless. And it is play those cards so you can play the lands you hit. It seems fun.
And it this existing, being a cycle, I hope that they are all kind of similar to this. That makes me happy too, because it is more of potentially a good, appealing thing for me to build around in the future. So it's not just this card existing in a vacuum makes me happy. It makes me happy for the whole of the set.
It's so funny to think back to the 6 mana Champions of Kamigawa version. And those were extremely important standard cards. They just mattered a bunch. And now you think about a 6 mana dragon like that having the same type of impact on the game. It's never going to quite go that way again. I like that they weren't super adherent to, tradition. That Elder Dragon Legend should always be these 6 mana things. I think you're right. Bringing it more in line with modern standards makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think Yosei would stand up to today's sensibilities, right? But the other ones, maybe not so much.
I think they wouldn't make Yosei anymore because of the tap prison stuff. I think they would try and avoid that. But that's what makes it so it could actually stand up today, right?
Right. I think you remember the Greater Good, Gifts Ungiving, Goryo's Vengeance deck?
I do.
I think that would be a fine standard deck.
I would happily play that deck for sure.
Hell yeah. So that's it for previews. If you have not seen the full art basics, definitely check those out. Maybe they're not for everyone or whatever, but I've seen almost unanimously positive reviews so far.
They're just beautiful. Obviously you could be at a saturation point with your full art lands, and maybe you have your full art lands that you want, but I love these, and I could see myself going deep, and maybe some shiny copies of these for my land box are in order.
Yeah, I could see it. I mean, I don't know when the next time I'm going to play live is, right? But
I don't think I shouldn't say that. A lot of people know when the next time is. I agree with you. I have no idea when I'll do it again either. Things are looking mighty grim these days for my next live event.
Yeah, it's not great, but I'm sure when that event rolls around, I will likely look into getting some copies of these because they're very nice. But I don't know. You talk about everyone has their basic land type, their favorite or whatever. And it's I do too, but at this point I have 4 different versions of those in my collection because I've been ooh, well now I'm going to play with these, and then a new cool one comes out. I'm just the fish, right?
I'm right there with you, but I will tell you that when I started appreciating these aesthetic things a little bit more, and I stopped viewing the cards as just utility pieces, I actually began to appreciate them more. So that's just me. Everyone's different, but it meant something to me when I actually started seeking out the versions of things I wanted. So I'm always grateful for those opportunities, even if I have a little bit of fatigue at this stage.
Well, I've always appreciated Japanese cards, so that was always a thing that I kind of tried to do, not super hardcore or anything, but it was definitely a thing that I did appreciate. It's yeah, they're game pieces, but I want to play with the ones that I like.
Yep.
If I can.
Sure. Absolutely.
Anyway, now on to present day items. We have Alchemy.
So I have 2 bookkeeping items I would like to get out of the way with regards to Alchemy.
Let's do it.
First, you said you were sitting this format out.
More or less.
Have you played this format?
So I had to write an article this week, and I asked Cedric Phillips whether or not he wanted Modern or Alchemy. Unfortunately, he said Alchemy. I gave him 2 options of those, and he chose one. And so then I built that deck and played with it.
Okay, but you are now in the Alchemy ecosystem. They have gotten your wild cards.
I've literally crafted 4 rares. That's it.
I gotcha. Hook, line, and sinker. Get that whale. Bring him in. Make the lamp oil from him.
I still have 20 rare wild cards left.
Well, I am out of wild cards.
Obviously.
I'm just out
Obviously.
Completely.
Did you have to re-up, though?
Several times, yes.
Oh, my God.
Building the Agalor deck didn't help. I mean, that was just like, may as well set my wild cards on fire.
The what deck?
Agalor.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So it's been lean times over in our household. I'm skipping meals now so I can get more wild cards. But we'll recover from this. We always make it out the other side. Second bookkeeping item. Arena Decklists Twitter account put out a poll earlier this week. Asking people, very simple question. Yes or no, basically a binary presentation. And I believe the exact wording was, do you like alchemy?
Yeah, basically. It was just like alchemy, parentheses, like, dislike, results, or whatever.
Can you present to me the results of that poll?
I'm looking it up right now.
Okay. I haven't seen the final results. I did vote, and I know what was leading when I cast my vote.
Yeah, I voted the same as you, by the way.
Okay. We'll talk about that once we have our tally here.
Okay. So, somewhat surprisingly, only 4,804 votes were cast.
Okay, so only about a sixth of our active followers, right?
Less. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe like a seventh, whatever. Like it was 23%, dislike it was 42%, results was 35%.
Okay, so like it, finishing a fairly distant third. I voted like it.
Same.
You voted like it. I am kind of, I don't know if sad is the right word. I'll get over it. I'm a little disappointed how it has hit thus far, because playing the games, I think it does what it set out to do. And it's a tentative like, for sure. I wasn't like slam dunk, absolutely in love with this format. They nailed it.
Also same.
But as far as a goal of like dealing with the problems of standard and making it a format that I could play now and conceivably continue to play in the future, because anything gets out of whack, I assume more adjustments are coming. I think they did it. And as long as that's happening, I'm probably going to continue to like Alchemy. I'm probably going to choose to play Alchemy over standard. I mean, you couldn't. I guess I do get paid to play standard. I still won't do it. And I just won't. It doesn't interest me right now, but I'll sit down and happily play some games of Alchemy and build decks. And it's an interesting space, but people have not really gotten on board. And how much of that do you think is born of actual Alchemy misses the mark, or how much of it is a growing frustration with just Arena as a whole?
I think there are a lot of parts, because, I mean, you also have to take into consideration that it's coming from like the AD Twitter account, which is an account, if you follow it, you are looking for like, standard technology deck list, like, winning things, right?
Yep. We share historic deck lists, but mostly you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that also adds to it, because like, I don't know. I feel like historic is also like a fairly entrenched market.
Yeah.
So basically my point is that those folks are usually among the loudest complainers on the internet. And it doesn't surprise me to see that like dislike won out over like to that crowd. Whereas I think that, consider our following versus the Arena player base as a whole. And our Twitter account is just a fraction of that player base. And I think it is predisposed to be the fraction of the player base that is predisposed to disliking it.
So I'm going to ask you a question that you can't possibly know the answer to, but I want your opinion anyway.
I can certainly try and speak as though I know the answer.
Great. That's all I ever ask.
I have many opinions.
So the main Wizards Magic Twitter puts out the exact same poll, how do their results differ from what we would get? Do you think they skew more heavily in favor of like?
So I think the folks that are like playing Alchemy and, you know, just like interacting with Arena in whatever way that they do, maybe it's like you log on, you know, once a day or once a week or however, you know, casually or whatever you want to define it. It's like those folks are very unlikely to be following like the Wizards Twitter account. I don't know. I think it's more reasonable for like a more less enfranchised or casual, however you want to describe that player, to not necessarily be like up to date on the latest news and all that versus just like logging into the game and playing it. And the people who are just logging into the game and playing like whatever it offers them, I imagine that they're probably going to like Alchemy. So I think it doesn't necessarily skew 100% like in the other direction. I think that there are probably going to be a lot of vocal people who dislike it, who are going to like seek out the poll once like their friend tells them that the poll is up or whatever. Even if they don't follow the account, they're going to go find it just to click dislike. Yeah. But I think it's going to be, you know, maybe closer to 60-40 than ours was with dislike. But
it's such an interesting, like, there's so many factors influencing how Twitter polls turn out. And I think it would be very easy to write off our poll as one that will attract people who are critical of Wizards, because we are often critical of Wizards.
Yeah, I can see that.
But at the same time, like, I actually sort of went out of my way to do the other thing and note in a response that I liked Alchemy, because I sort of wanted to fight against that interpretation of the poll, because there's no reason to lie to us in the poll. Like, I really want to know what people think about this format, because it's going to influence how we approach it. Like, are we going to continue to produce content about it? How deeply are we going to engage with it? Anytime something like this comes up, we have to decide what our response is as content creators as well as players. So it's multifaceted, it's complicated, and I really just wanted some data points. But most of the feedback I have gotten from the broader player base is it leans negative. People are not thrilled about this. And I think very little of it has to do with actual sit down and play a game of Alchemy. Almost none of it.
Well, because that almost has nothing to do with it. Right. Because the things that they're railing against are, you know, my historic card got nerfed and I'm not getting a wild card back. And that's horseshit. It just is. Right. They should absolutely fix that. And that is a thing that we need to constantly be bringing up so that they know that it is a point of contention, a thing that we don't like, a thing that they have to fix eventually.
Yeah. And it's frustrating because like no implementation of the game can ever stand on its own. Nothing can ever be taken at face value because it's all reflective of like how much of this is a money-making scheme. Scheme is harsh. How much of this is designed with profit in mind? How much of this is designed with this other thing in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some schemes, man.
Yeah.
You know, this is it's not really a scheme, but
no.
Yeah, it is definitely trying to do the thing where they print money.
But those are questions that like Magic has had to answer from the beginning.
I know.
Magic has changed the way games are monetized and how all of this works. And it is weird and complicated, but I understand very much being frustrated about Historic. And I think these people are like sort of right. The only way anything happens is if you're loud about it. And actually the only way anything really happens about it is if it affects the bottom line. So,
well, I think no matter what, people are just going to keep playing. And there's just so many people involved that it's difficult to organize anything that would affect their bottom line anyway. So I don't think that even like, I don't know, bringing that up as a way to combat it is reasonable because you can't really act on it.
Even if that's true, though, like no one wants to sit there silently. You know what I mean? Like if it does.
So like I'm not playing in it because I think like the buy-in is too high. So many of these things are rares and mythics, and also the historic thing is just a complete mess. And I'm doing that, but I also know that it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, I get it. It's hard not to be defeatist about this stuff because we've just been through it too many times. I'll say that I saw some coverage of the Alchemy format in places where I wouldn't expect really to see it, like, esportsy type places where they were talking about how the economic realities of Arena are getting to be harsh. I saw a really nice thread from Drew Levin who discussed, I don't know if you caught this, but just laying out his thoughts on the monetization in general. And Drew's got a background in working on this type of stuff.
Yeah, Drew's gas. Very, very knowledgeable on this stuff.
Yep, very interesting to hear from an industry insider and, a fan of Magic as well, and who really knows his stuff when it comes to online gaming monetization and his thoughts on it. So I don't know what our engagement with this particular topic has to be. I sort of want to say this is the last time we go there. Know that we share the same concerns that our listeners do. As far as the historic model, it sucks. There needs to be some type of wildcard refunds. And I agree that the Arena economy feels like it's spiraling out of control. But I think for now, I just mostly want to talk about the cards as Magic cards.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's important to cover the format regardless of how much people want to play it, because there are going to be people who are like complaining about it, but then playing the PTQ because it's a PTQ.
Right.
And I think that that's reasonable, but for you to say something like, with the poll, like, is it indicative of people's just like gut reactions, or is it them actually sitting down and playing? It's like, I find it difficult to ask someone to sit down and actually play with it because the buy-in is so large.
Fair. No, it's a fair criticism.
You know what I mean? And so for me, I was able to like play a deck. Like, I waited a few days and saw the things that were doing pretty well, or like the things that people liked. And then I pitched a topic to Cedric that was a deck that only had 4 alchemy cards in it. And I think that's a way for other people to interact with the format too. It's not how I would normally interact with it. Right. And that's basically what you've been doing, where you're like, oh, I'm going to play with all like the shiny new things. Like you built an Oglor deck, which, rip your wild cards. But like, I knew going in, that was the thing where it's like, this is probably going to miss. So I'm just not even going to waste my time.
Very good choice. And I also think you chose your topic very well, because not only did you make a good deck, I think that something along the lines of what you were working on is actually the best deck in Alchemy as it stands right now. And I think the tools are somewhat limited to challenge it. I am talking about mono black sacrifice / blood / stuff. I don't even know how to classify this deck. There's a lot of different looks at it. You've seen snow builds, blood on the snow focus going really high. Personally, I like the leaner, low to the ground builds like you were working on. Sanguine Brushstroke is the truth. That card, it makes some cardboard, man. And it's like, it leaves so much behind. And I started, when I was building other decks, I realized how important Sanguine Brushstroke was going to be to the format. So I'm like, well, I sort of need to slot some low cost enchantment removal into my deck. So things like Outland Liberator started making the cut in my werewolves list. But you can't really interact with Sanguine Brushstroke that way, because it leaves behind so much cardboard in addition to that reach that it then derives from the blood tokens. It's just a house of a card.
Yeah. I think the blood artist is the main thing, right? Yeah. And it's not just like, oh, it gives you another payoff for sacrificing things or things dying. Like you now have it in combination with Meat Hook Massacre, which means that you get to double up a lot more often, and that's how you win a lot of your games. But like, it also creates like an actual 2-drop, whereas your 2-drops were not very good before, and now your Agadeem's Awakenings, along with like all of your good ones, and now you have Blood Artist at 2, and you have Fellstinger at 3, which is like a relatively new addition too. So your Agadeem's Awakenings are just like fully charged in the mid to late game too. Overall, it's pretty nice. But like, yeah, the Brushstroke itself, once it's in play, at least for the way that I've been building the deck, like, isn't that big of a deal, because you're not going super hard on blood stuff, although there are definitely builds out there that do. There are, but even in the instance where you're not going super hard, if you have access to a reasonable amount of blood, and usually it's just, you'll have to forgive me, the 2-mana vampire, when something dies, makes a blood token. Voldaren Bloodcaster. You don't have to go much harder than that. The amount of reach you get in some scenarios where it's like, oh, wait, if I just
Meat Hook Massacre my board away, and my opponent's one creature, and I make 4 blood tokens, I actually have lethal here from this otherwise very stable position. But it's not just like that one instance. The deck is 40 different ways to come up with, I just have lethal. Like, my Felstinger is coming towards your face, or here's my Blood Artist turn where I'm able to sacrifice a bunch of things, or I already have Meat Hook Massacre on the battlefield. Or if I play this Meat Hook Massacre just empty, my opponent can never kill a creature again, and there's no way they can win through that scenario. And just reach after reach after reach after card draw after card draw after card draw. So it just does its thing every game. You first shipped a version with 12 1-drops. I know you've moved that number around a bit, but like, I think that's huge too, where you just consistently have that 1-drop threat. You can always go Deadly Dispute into bigger play on your next turn. And I also like what you've been working on as far as your top end of the deck, which I haven't seen anyone else do. But if you listened to our show last week, I think this move makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I think I started with like a more traditional version, like closer to what people were playing in Standard before. It was like, you play like some Lolths. I already decided that Blood on the Snow is probably like a little bit too slow because the format's relatively powerful with all these new cards. And I was already like, you can't play like that much top end, right? So then I was playing with like some Lolths and stuff, and it's like obviously a very powerful card and does work well with all the rest of the stuff in the deck, but it's also just completely unnecessary because you have redundancy for everything now. You have like Meat Hook and Blood Artist. You have 12 1-drops. You have Deadly Dispute and Felstinger. So you're just like doubled and tripled up on a lot of these effects to the point where you don't really need the Lolth type of stuff anymore. So at that point, I was just like, just cut all the stuff that's above 3 mana because you don't really need it. And while that's mostly true, Key to the Archive is kind of just like too good not to play in a lot of instances. And this deck is very good at slowing your opponent down because you have the 12 1-drops that are either going to like, block stuff or get Deadly Disputed away. You have Infernal Grasp and a bunch of other different early game removal spells if you want. You have Felstinger to block. Like, you're so good at getting to turn 4 at like 15 life and be able to just like spend your mana just like drawing more cards if you want to. But like Key to the Archive is so much better than that stuff because you get a really good magic card out of it most of the time. And then it also just allows your Meat Hook Massacres to scale up to kill stuff like Old Growth Troll or whatever that might outsize it normally. So, the deck just also has a bunch of card drawing, a bunch of ways to use its mana. So getting a thing that ramps you twice is also really good. So, Key has been super nice. I don't think that it's like a sacred cow type of thing where you absolutely can't cut it from the archetype. But right now, like the way the deck is lined up, the way the format's lined up, like you can definitely play some with a very low opportunity cost. It's not, you never have hands where you're like, it's like too clunky for me to play out Key or whatever. So I think that if you can get away with playing the card, you absolutely should, but there might be a time and place where you can't.
One of the things we talked about going into the pre-Alchemy season was that you just shouldn't run out of cardboard anymore. There's too many ways to generate things. And especially in this deck where everything is the same, everything is redundant, you're super good at drawing a bunch of cards with Felstinger and Deadly Dispute. And if you need a copy of Village Rites too, so be it. Your Agadeem's Awakenings will rebuy a bunch of stuff and draw more cards. And all of these things, you're only limited by how much mana you have, despite the fact that everything in your deck costs 1, 2, or 3. That's really the only limitation you face. And if you have more mana, you're almost certainly going to find a way to use it. And the points where I really have not lost many games with this deck, but the points where I am threatened is where things do get too big. Something like Dragons outscales the removal I have available. It's very easy to massacre away a board full of 2 toughness creatures, but it gets harder when you start dealing with 4s and 5s. But not really if you have Key to the Archive. You'll just reach that mana threshold because you're never missing a land drop because you draw cards all the time and have environmental sciences. So it's a strange fit. It may not really seem like it's the card for the deck at first blush, but play with it a little bit and it does make a lot of sense and just gives you access to such powerful effects that you shouldn't have access to. Like, Claim the Firstborn is probably the worst card that you can get from Key to the Archive.
But good in the deck.
Really good in this deck. Yeah, I've had so many blowouts of my opponent with claim the firstborn. So really no way for this card to go wrong. Time Warp, forget about it. You're just running away with the game.
Yeah, it's funny too in writing the article and talking about things. It's like I'm putting forth a best of 3 version because I'm mostly playing best of 3, but I recognize that with 4 eye twitch, you could certainly fill out your sideboard with more lessons, and like Containment Breach is like the Green Disenchant, Teachings of the Archaic was already like in the conversation for things that you could play even in mono black. And because of like the Faceless Haven nerf, and because you're not playing Blood on the Snow, and because now you have so many black 1-drops, you kind of want all your lands to make black, so you don't really have to play Faceless Haven anymore, which means that if you wanted to play off-color pathways to facilitate the lessons, you could. And then with Key to the Archive, it was like, well, sometimes they just blow up your key, and that might be a more common thing. Like, you were talking about putting Outland Liberator in your Werewolves deck, right? And
yep.
If you get an Electrolyze or something like that, and your key gets blown up, you're just kind of sunk unless you're able to get a couple treasure tokens together. But I think it's like actually technically correct for you to just play a bunch of off-color pathways now in case that situation happens. Or if you're playing best of 1 and want to use a bunch of off-color lessons, like that's fine too.
Yeah, seems fine to me. I do think you'll always spend as much black mana as possible. So you certainly want to not trick yourself into over setting up for any of these scenarios.
Right.
But having that emergency out will certainly be useful.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's really weird too, because I did it for a couple games when I switched to best of 1 just to get like more reps and see if people were playing things that were dramatically different than best of 3. And so I did add some pathways and like the lessons and stuff. And it was annoying that it was like basically an extra click every time when I was basically never, playing like the blue side of the blue pathway or whatever. So if you want to just kind of be lazy about it, I totally understand that. And yeah, it was never like, oh, I'm going to like on turn 2 play my blue pathway just in case. Nah, it just like never happened. It was never correct to do so.
Yep.
Like turn 4, maybe you can make an argument for it, but even then, it's risky and it could come back to bite you. So I think you default to black, and this is just like your emergency out, and it may not be worth the struggles in that case of the clicks. But in an optimal world where you have a big alchemy tournament coming up, certainly should consider that line. Yeah, a bunch of little optimizations that you can do, and the deck has a ton of different options, especially now with Cursebound Witch in the mix. You have so many 1-drops that you are maybe incentivized to play a copy or 2 of Village Rites, and that was something that I experimented with. But between like Deadly Dispute and Felstinger, it seemed fine to just have the 8. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's like all the different removal combinations. You play some copies of Bloodcaster to be able to make some more bloods to get a little bit more use out of your brushstrokes. You could play Jadar as more sacrifice fuel for Felstinger and Village Rites, Eaten Alive, stuff like that if you want to. Also gives you like a little bit more of a clock, which is not that bad, and a consistent like dice trigger every turn for Blood Artist, which is cool too. So a lot of different ways to build in the archetype, even though it's just ostensively a mono black deck, which is kind of weird considering it's like still a pretty small standard too, but Alchemy does add a lot of cards. Does a lot of meaningful ones, especially for this color too. So it sounds like we agree on the best deck. I wonder if we agree on what else we see in the top tiers. For me, right behind mono black, and maybe only behind because I worked on it less recently, is both Izzet Control and Azorius Control. I think both of these decks still have tremendous tools. In the case of Izzet, Galvanic Iteration, still a messed up Magic card, even in the absence of Alrund's Epiphany. It is very easy to play tempo-ish style of games with things like Fading Hope, just work up to Hellbreak Horror, or a bunch of other of the very diverse threats that the Izzet deck has access to. You have things like Smoldering Egg, Leer. All these options are completely reasonable, all worth considering. So I still have had a lot of success with Izzet. And then there's Azorius, which I think benefits mostly from Divine Purge and having what I believe is the best sweeper in the Alchemy format.
the thing with the blood tokens and treasures and clues has become way more relevant than I expected to.
Yeah.
Given the prevalence of mono black and just how good it is. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that I didn't see coming to reach out into Azorius, and you can still do all the end games. You can do Hullbreaker Horror end games there. You can do Teferi Key to the Archive. I think that is completely reasonable. You can just do what's the big Seek spell card? Discover something, I think. Man, they added a whole bunch of new cards for me to remember the names of. Basically, six mana instant, seek 3 non-land cards, and then reduce the cost of all the hand. This card is gas. Have you played with this card?
It is. Well, I haven't because I don't own it, but I've certainly played against it, and I've also been watching a bunch of streams. But that card didn't register as a seek card for me for whatever reason. It's just like, it's draw 3, but it's better than that, right? Because you have to draw spells to reduce the mana cost or whatever. But so control I have not worked on because it would require a lot of new cards, but control to me does seem like the thing that is potentially broken because of all the cost reduction. There's like, is it Geist Blaster?
Some kind of Geist. Geist Blaster sounds very weird to me, but it might be called that.
Is 2 mana 1/3 that reduces an instant or sorcery by 2.
Yeah.
So you do that to the 6 mana card that then like draws you 3 spells and reduces their cost. You have Key to the Archive for ramp. You can do Teferi things if you want. So that
all this stuff plays really well with Divide by 0 too, because you're just putting more cards into your hand, and like Mascot Exhibition being cost reduction. And if you ever Galvanic Iteration the seat card, you're going off at that point, basically.
Yeah. So all of that stuff seems very, very powerful to me. Just too much of a wildcard investment.
Fair enough. I think that is very much on par with the mono black deck for the best thing to be doing in the format. A little disappointing that the Izzet stuff is as good as it is because it feels a lot like standard. But that's really the only hard overlap with standard I see. Now, I still think that Alchemy is too similar to standard to justify its existence at this moment because the play patterns are all in the same vein-ish. I think that problem only stands, though, for a couple more sets, because once every set has an Alchemy release tied to it, there's no way this card pool tracks standard at all. It'll just diverge so completely. So at the moment, it's a little strange. I think that's going to, as time goes on, be less and less of a problem. Yeah,
there is definitely going to be a point where it diverges so wildly, either because the Alchemy cards are so good or something. I don't know. Maybe there's just like too many different things to be doing in Alchemy that like the standard stuff doesn't keep up power level wise, or because the strategies just become inherently different. What if there's like a mono black sort of control-y deck in standard and in Alchemy, and they just end up playing like 30 different cards, right? Like that could very easily be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue it already is. The difference in having a deck with Sanguine Brushstroke and Cursebound Witch is pretty large. I think that plays completely differently than anything that's offered in standard. And even if there is a mono black deck in standard, just not the same. And obviously we know the context is a world difference with the absence of Epiphany. So
right. Yeah, it's interesting because you're talking about Galvanic Iteration being so good still, which is true, and the control decks being able to go over the top and everything. But in the case of the mono black deck, like there's no way to really, put them away to the point where they're not just going to get drained out eventually.
Correct.
So that is the interesting turning point. Like when you don't have Alrund's Epiphany, like how are you actually going to kill the black deck that has Infernal Grasps and a bunch of life gain and stuff?
Yeah, that's why it's strange. The Hullbreaker Horror stuff is good, but against specifically mono black, I think they can often just reach right through you and you don't necessarily benefit from resetting their board a bunch of times. All their stuff costs 1, 2. They have a ton of mana available. So it's an awkward situation. I think that's a huge part of the appeal of Divine Purge, is a way to clean all this stuff up a little bit more. But you got to clean it all up, or like you have to gain a bunch of life or something to be able to put these black decks away, because they will hang around against all the control decks for sure.
Yeah, they go toe to toe with you in card advantage. So you're both going to have like 7 cards on every turn, and there's just going to be a ton of fireworks. And I think eventually you're going to get nickel and dimed out, and I'm not sure what the best way to prevent that is.
Yep. So that is why I have mono black a little bit higher right now, is because I've worked on that more recently. I want to go back to the drawing board, think about improving both Izzet and Azorius against mono black, really think about my end games a little bit more and how to sort of go back over the top of them. I think they can figure that puzzle out. Most of the lists I have seen thus far aren't focused enough on that matchup, which is fair. There's no real metagame yet, but I have a strong sense that if there was a real tournament right now, I think mono black is the deck to beat.
I think so too. I don't know if other folks feel the same, because there's definitely a lot of love for Inquisitor Captain, and there's like party setups or just cleric setups. The interaction with Glasspool Mimic is obviously very strong. There are some decks that are playing like Key to the Archive and Teleportation Circle and trying to get like a lot more value that way. So there's a lot of different instances of that archetype, and people obviously love it. I think that it's very cool. And I also think that it probably loses to a well-built mono black or control deck.
Yep, that's been my experience. I think the deck is super cool. I think there's a bunch of ways to do it. Here's a little bit of a warning. You haven't experienced this yet because you haven't spent the wild cards. If you hit Glasspool Mimic enough times off your Inquisitor Captain, it stops working at some point. So just be aware of that.
What do you mean? How does it stop working?
Because you don't have enough creatures in your library, graveyard, or it doesn't check the battlefield.
Sure.
Yeah. So you run below the threshold at some point. And in my case, I copied the Inquisitor Captain again. There was something better to copy though at that moment.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, because
it's weird. It's a corner case, and I didn't really know what was happening when it first happened. I'm like, well, I still have 20, but if I am correct, it just doesn't check stuff on the battlefield.
Yeah, graveyard hand library. So yeah, I was initially positing like, oh, you could play like 22 creatures.
Nope,
that's probably wrong. When you have Glasspool.
Yep. Yeah, you can go through the whole set, and I actually lost the game because of it. So yeah, just something to keep track of. I don't know how often it's going to come up, but that is like the go-to interaction with Inquisitor Captain right now. Help to hit a Glasspool Mimic, and when you do, you keep the train rolling. All these decks seem good, but a tier below what I'm presently playing. The cleric stuff is interesting. A lot of clerics lists I've seen are just like making big bodies and doing life gain shenanigans, and I don't think that beats anyone. I think absolutely every deck can play through big bodies, maybe with the exception of like werewolves, which is why I would also have werewolves a tier below the decks we've spoken about thus far.
Same. I agree with that. I think that werewolves got a lot of upgrades, but it's also like, okay, well, now you're a playable Gruul aggro deck, and you have to compete with all these like supercharged versions of these other archetypes. So you still end up being like a step below, which is pretty unfortunate, but it's still viable. It is still definitely a thing that you can do if you're, really pigeonholing yourself into wanting to play that archetype, or that is the archetype that you've invested the wild cards in or whatever.
Yep. I think it's okay. It just has some strategical weaknesses. But as far as like you're paired against random deck on the ladder that someone's trying out, werewolves is one of the most brutal tests you can put them to. I just think in terms of what's actually very good in the format, they don't line up great.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had games against them from the mono black side of things where they just get out of control too quick. They have a full curve. They start on turn one now, or they can. And then Reckless Stormseeker is still very good. Volatile Arsonist, is that the card?
Volatile Arsonist.
The 5-drop 4/4 haste menace that deals one to three things. It's like that ends up like being pretty good against like your crappy Shambling Gas blockers and stuff. So
yeah, I remember I liked this card in previous season, and it kind of fell off my radar.
Yeah, I didn't really like it because the comparison to Goldspan Dragon was just like, why would you ever? But as it turns out, when you nerf Goldspan Dragon, then this card seems to be more appealing, so.
Oh, that's a really nice transition. A deck that we haven't really spoken about that I think is actually a tier above stuff like clerics, stuff like werewolves, is the Dragons deck. Have you seen this deck much? Played with it?
I've played against it a couple times, but it seemed like the players that I played against had like, the beta versions of the deck or whatever. It didn't seem like they were super well tuned. Definitely saw like a lot of random card choices that I wouldn't expect to be in the final version. But yeah, it's weird where like the Inquisitor Captain decks are very value-based. They go wide. They never really run out of gas. And the Dragons deck, to me, seems like more similar to mono green, where you're like, jam a big threat, and like maybe the last one kills you. Is that accurate, or is there a better way to
100% accurate? 100% accurate. I do think it has more reach than you would anticipate at first blush. I agree with you that most of the lists I've seen have been built what I would say is incorrectly. I think you're supposed to focus on some pretty clear things. You want to make sure you're maximizing your 4-drop on turn 3. I think that means, you max your Whelp, you max your Orb of Dragonkind, and you should probably look at some Brazen Outlaws as well, Magdas, because you just need to do this thing. You are mulliganing any hand that cannot accelerate starting on turn 2. So make it happen as much as possible. After that, there's this selection of 4-drops. I see a lot of Moonveil Regents. I love that card. I don't think it really fits in this archetype. It's never going to actually chain you into multiple cards because that's just not how your deck is set up.
Mana Curve's a little too clunky for that.
Yeah, so the way I've set up my deck is, I think it's interesting. So you're going to let me toot my own horn a little bit about my build.
Let's go.
And see if I can get other people on board. So like I said, I have 10 of the 2-drop accelerants. I don't think you can play like a full 4 Magda. That's kind of silly. I'm on a snow-covered mana base. I think Faceless Haven is important due to some of the other cards I'm playing. My 4-drops of choice, I have the full set of Town Razor Tyrant. I think that one's like default. Very, very good.
Busted card.
Yeah. After that, I go Manaform Hellkite in my 4 slot. Now, that seems weird until I tell you about some of the other spells I'm playing. I max Shatter Skull Smashing. I also have two Alchemist Gambit, which is the piece that I think so many of these decks are missing that they 100% should be playing. I can't tell you what percentage of my games I win with Alchemist Gambit. It's very, very high, though. So many of my games are just setting up spots where like I Goldspan Dragon attack, have 3 mana left over, Alchemist Gambit, and then we're off to the races and everything's good. And I don't know why I haven't seen as many of these in the list as there should be present. I get it's a scary card, but this is just what your deck does. It just throws a big threat at you and hopes it's enough. And if you give your opponents enough time, even things like mono black are going to invalidate the stupid, here's my big dragon, what are you going to do about it plan. So that's another reason why I'm into the snow mana base. Faceless Haven is important in those scenarios because it's just a little bit of extra reach you can have on the battlefield. As far as playing a little bit longer game and just being like, oh, here's my thing, can I do anything else? I have the Orb of Dragonkind, which I think is great in terms it's both the accelerant and being able to go to the top of your deck. I also have 3 Chandra Dress to kill. I've seen some people play 4. I don't think you should ever play none. I think playing some number of this card is good, both because it gives you turn 4 Goldspan Dragon, and it's a way to get a little bit more reach into your deck as far as both direct damage and just finding more threats. So this card seems like another perfect fit to me. Then we just have removal. I have 3 Frostbite, 4 Dragonfire just to clean stuff up. You can make an argument that exile-based removal might be better in the Frostbite slot right now, but I think the 3 Toughness Breakpoint has come up a few times for me. Inquisitor Captain is a big one where like just cleaning that up nicely with your 1 mana card is good.
Matters against werewolves too.
Matters against werewolves. But I think the big thing is the Alchemist Gambit, Manaform Hellkite, Shatter Skull Smashing setup. I think that is what has taken my list to a little bit higher level than some of the other lists I've seen around.
Yeah, I like that. That sounds good to me. So you just have the 12 dragons and that's it?
2 Manaform, 4 Town Razor, 4 Goldspan, 2 Inferno of the Star Mount.
Okay. Yeah, so you do have 12, just not the 12 I thought.
Yes. You can make a case that you just max Manaform Hellkite. I don't hate that. Or you can also make a case that I should actually have more than 12 because things like Orb of Dragonkind whiffing would be an absolute disaster. But the slots are tight. I'm not budging on Alchemist Gambit. I think it's critical to the archetype. And I'm really big on having some extra 2-drop accelerants. So I think I'd be cutting removal in that spot. And in some metagames, that's probably fine. And you can just max the dragon count a little bit more. For the time being, I've been happy with this distribution, though.
Yeah, I would think that if you're playing 10 2-drops to try and accelerate to a 4, you would want 8 4s.
Just maximize 4s. Yeah, that's fair. I think Inferno is like a big boom boom, and you hit those mana thresholds a lot, but your point is also reasonable, and maybe that's something I can look at in terms of just really maximizing that curve. And then maybe there's even room for like a third Magda in that scenario where you're that focused on the 4.
Yeah, maybe. No, that sounds good to me. I like that end game. That sounds really good.
Yeah, Alchemist Gambit is just such an explosive card here because it's so cheap. Like the 3 mana threat of this card, when you have Goldspan Dragon producing 2 mana for you, you can just do it at almost any time.
Final Fortune is good, y'all.
It is. It's a good Magic card.
It is an old one, probably older than a significant portion of our listeners.
Yeah.
But yeah, that card used to kill people, and it was pretty good. And I think that there have been like some iterations of it over the years, whereas like maybe a deck would play one or they would sideboard one or whatever. But in a deck like this, where you are just like, play a big threat, you don't really have anything resembling a long game, especially against a bunch of decks that can play a long game and will bury you in card advantage. I think having an effect like that is super important. So that's a good find.
I'll tell you too, if you're real scared of Final Fortune, you'll cast this for 7 quite a bit as well. With your access to treasures, it's really not hard to hit your breakpoints there and just go ahead and take the extra turn.
Yeah, I can't do the pathway stuff because of the snow mana base.
Correct.
But the treasures make it seem fine to me.
Yep, completely fine.
Yeah, especially once you have Magnet too. You have enough things that are doing that sort of stuff.
Yep. So I think that kind of closes out my top of the line stuff. Anything I didn't mention that you've been impressed with?
Not really, because I've been playing mono black and just kind of killing people. So
yeah, it really feels like it has no bad matchups as it's set up right now. I am sure there's something you can do against it, but I spent most of my time working on it and not really trying to beat it. Now I want to go back in and see if I can find some ways to get ahead of mono black.
The scariest stuff has been the folks jumping through all of the hoops to try and make Epiphany a thing, because that sort of strat does still go over the top of you. And I don't think it's good enough against the other decks in the format, but it's certainly something that's viable,
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen it a lot with the Geist you mentioned, the mana reduction Geist, and sure, that seems very reasonable to me.
Yeah, so that's been the scariest thing where, is it foretells a card on turn 2 and I'm just like, damn it. But
I've felt this before. I've been through this.
Yeah. So that's been about it. But when they're just like Jeskai or Azorius or whatever, it's like, yeah, you're doing like some cool stuff. You're drawing a bunch of cards, but they can never stick anything to actually kill you. So it doesn't really matter.
Yep. For sure.
And if they ever figure out that piece of the puzzle, then things might be a little bit different. But as is, it just seems like it's mono black all the way.
With you. On the whole, though, I'm very appreciative that I had a reason to go back and touch these cards again. I just would have been done with this card pool. I was not going back to standard. It was not for me. So I'm thankful this exists. In my eyes, the best case scenario would have been cleaning up the problems of standard and finally putting it in a good place. This is probably the second best thing you could offer me right now. So I will take it.
Yeah, it's fine. I mostly put the poll out as like a reality check because I didn't really mind this existing. And also it existing does not come as a surprise to me because, they were already tinkering with the historic rebalance stuff with like Oko and 3-drop Teferi and stuff like that. So it's like, okay, clearly they're experimenting in this space. They want to make it happen. And there have been like talks over like the last few years when Arena was coming out where it was like, how would you feel if we just like added cards to standard? And I guess this was happening like when Marvel was a thing, because it was like, well, if we had like Duress and Pithing Needle, would this even be an issue? And they were like, do we want to actually ban cards or can we just like print these cards in standard? Well, if we had mostly digital client, could we do it like on the digital client? What would it mean if we separated like standard and digital standards? Like they've been having these conversations for a long time. This was just a matter of time more than anything. But yeah, I just wanted to see where like people were and where their heads were at. And obviously it's not the most scientific poll ever or whatever, but it was definitely interesting to see the results. I kind of wish that we got like 20,000 replies on it, though. It was like, 5,000 was lower than I was expecting.
Larger sample size, always better. But I don't think there's any sample size we could have gotten to where we would have been like, yes, now we know how the people feel. So.
No, I mean, for all we know, we could scale up the sample size and get the same results, right? So
totally possible.
It doesn't really matter, but it's still just strange for an account with 30,000 followers, and then I retweeted from mine with like 40,000, and it was still only like 5,000. It's like, oh, it's not a lot.
People have had it with our polls and our intrusions on their timeline. I told you, Jerry, never tweet. Nothing good ever comes of it.
I hate Alchemy so much, I'm not even going to click on this post. Or I love Alchemy so much, I'm playing it and I'm not on Twitter.
I don't have time for this Twitter poll.
Like, who knows what happened, and who knows if like the results are, actively anything reasonable or realistic. But it was fun. It was interesting. It was a thing that actually got me to tweet, which is a rarity these days.
Yeah, there we go. It got you out of your tweet cave to come out for your once a year tweet excursion onto the internet. How'd you like it? Did it feel like a warm, welcoming place?
It was mostly fine, right? Because it was just like numbers rolling in.
Yes. No actual interaction.
Yeah. So that was cool. Like I said, I wanted those numbers to go higher. I expected them to be a little bit higher. But there were also folks who took the time to type out a reply. And I think that gave me more insight into how people were feeling than a poll ever could. So I appreciate the folks like sharing their actual thoughts. And I think that they mirrored a lot of the stuff that, we're seeing already, where it's like very expensive, or like, why does this exist versus like literally anything else you could have done, or why am I not getting wild cards for my nerfed historic cards, stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, okay. We get it.
Give the people their wild cards.
Just do it. It literally costs you nothing. Like, you can make up some BS excuse where like, oh, it means that they won't buy packs in the future because they have like 4 wild cards on their account, but that's bullshit. Just do it. Just make them happy. Make them like not be mad every time they log into your client.
I just want to not be mad once.
Yeah.
Just once in my life. I just want to feel that the clarity of no anger in my soul. That's all I ask for. Especially
in this instance, man. It's so minuscule, right? It's like not that many cards. It's just not a big deal. Just do it. It's fine.
Game.
Good luck.